Hello everyone and welcome to this latest of our repowering sessions and talks. Repowering is going to be an issue going forward for us in the UK as a lot of the renewables projects come offline at the end of their life. It's going to mainly be onshore wind to start with, but we can see solar coming down the line as well. I'm delighted to be joined today by Alec Whiter, who's on the grid regulatory and power sales side alongside myself. Alec, welcome.
Thank you very much, Ross.
I suppose if I start with the first question, everyone assumes that if you've got a project and you're repowering on an existing site, that it must be a lot easier because you've already got a project there and therefore everything's in place. Is that the case from your perspective?
I wish it was, Ross. I wish it was. No, I think you touched on a very good point, which is that instinctively it should be simpler. And the reason for that is that you have a grid connection, you have consented, you've got land rights, you've got everything else that you think should be there for the project. But I think the one of the key things to think about is effectively what you're doing is you're building a new project. And a lot of that means that the existing infrastructure and the contractual arrangements that you've got to date might need to be replaced. So from a grid perspective particularly, you might have a grid connection agreement that might be in the project co's name, but the technology and the turbines for which that grid connection relates to will most likely be superseded. You're going to be building a bigger project, quite possibly with different turbines, different outputs, and that will have an impact on your ability to reuse that connection agreement. So a really good example would be the maximum export capacity. If you're repowering, you're probably going to want to put in bigger turbines. If you want to get a bigger capacity of project and export more electricity, you're going to have to speak to your distribution network operator or the national energy system operator and potentially ask for a variation to increase your export capacity. And that will then mean that you're subject to potentially the connection queue, which is a really hot topic at the moment. Another area is regulation in terms of the revenues. So we are in a very different world to where we were, 10, 15, 12 years ago. We don't have the feed-in tariff anymore. We don't have the renewable obligation. We do have contracts for difference, which is the scheme that was set up obviously in around 2014, really positive. And we've seen the most recent evolutions from government to allow a repowering CFD. But there's a lot to think about there. It's no longer if you build it, you will get it.
Yeah.
It is very much a competition. So a lot of the decision making and strategizing around revenue, around capacity, around supply chain, you'll need to start thinking about that now and working out what impact that will have and how you want to generate revenue from your project.
Okay, no, so lots of things to think about. Can I just bring it back to grid just for a moment? Because if you've got an existing connection, and I take your point about, applying for variations and so forth, but is there a way, and what should people be thinking about to try and hang on to that grid connection and preserve it rather than grid taking it away and you having, as you say, to go back to the back of the queue? Are there ways you can do that?
So I think, firstly, if you have a connection agreement, you should be in a better place than if you don't. So if you're applying for connection capacity from the scratch, clearly that is a different type of project. When you're looking at your own connection agreement, obviously, the other thing to bear in mind around it is that at distribution network level, you'll have a use it or lose it clause within the national terms of connection. Now, we haven't really seen that being activated yet, but it is a really interesting question, something to ponder around whether the distribution network operators might try and claw back capacity when there's a repowering. We think it's unlikely because if we look at Clean Power 30 and some of the future energy scenarios, it's very clear that we need all of these existing sites to be repowered. But at the moment, there is uncertainty there. The other thing to think,
I suppose it does push you to get on with it, doesn't it? Because
exactly. And I think that's one of the key points that's coming out of this is you need to start having those conversations now with the DNO, with the transmission system owners, to make sure that what you are forecasting, what you're hoping will be made available to you, is made available to you, and that there isn't effectively a scenario where suddenly a capacity is withdrawn or the connection offer needs to be amended. I think the other thing to mention just around these types of projects is actually quite a lot of the infrastructure has historically been installed on land that's been leased by the generators, with some of the substation leases being 25 years or slightly shorter. And there are other provisions in some of the leases around the ownership of that connection offer or agreement after the decommissioning of the site. And that gives rise to a really interesting question. Whose connection agreement is it? And I think there is a point there. A lot of these leases will have been entered into, 20 years ago. At the time, the terms seemed absolutely fine, and they might still be. But the fact that you hold a connection agreement now doesn't necessarily mean you're always entitled to it. So I think there is definitely a point around looking at your leases and working out what the decommissioning obligations are and the transfer of contractual obligations.
Okay, no, that is interesting. You talked about the incentive regime there as well. I guess new projects now, when we see the new wind projects, the new solar projects coming in, they're tending to have the capability of being hybrid projects. People are thinking about obviously battery storage is the most obvious example of these, but even now we're starting to see hydrogen coming in as well, and so that the repowered project may be quite different to the original one in terms of a collection of different technologies. How does that work through?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the redesign, as you say. So when we think about the co-location of different types of technology and what that's doing is that relates to different revenue streams and potentially these days also curtailment risk. So what is the chance of your grid connection capacity being curtailed? So you need to develop an alternative strategy to try and generate revenue, which again gives rise to some interesting questions, because a lot of the early connection agreements that have been offered are actually curtailment free. So they are relatively firm, and it's expected that all of the generation capacity can be exported. But when it comes to a revenue perspective, might there be better revenue available from co-locating it with storage, with hydrogen production, with major energy demand? I think the answer might be yes, and that gives rise to the point around future-proofing. So build in as much optionality as you can when you're looking at the repowering leases and replacement land arrangements. But be careful, because that might again trip you up in terms of variations to your grid connection offer and having to apply and speak to the DNOs around what you're doing. It also is relevant to any CFD conversations or repowering. Are you going for a private wire CFD? Are you going for a dual scheme facility CFD? That's really quite important, because both of them have different terms and conditions. And in some cases, you can end up tripping yourself up if you've applied for a dual scheme facility and end up only with one project, as in just a export to grid. There is also an awful lot of complex interaction between hydrogen production and sort of the low carbon hydrogen standard and the CFD regime. And that takes quite a lot to work through. So I think going back to what we're sort of trying to focus on, it's go in with a plan, work through the interactions and know what you want to achieve, and then try and implement it and have those conversations as early as possible.
And it might, as you say, it might push you down a simpler route just for ease of deployment and ease of getting the project built.
Exactly.
Fine. Okay. Well, look, let's finish up. It's really interesting. I suppose usual question from me is top tips from the grid power sales incentives perspective, top tips for anyone considering repowering. You've talked a lot already about that, but are there anything else that you want to mention?
Well, I think the first point around all of this is that we are in a different landscape now. And that affects everything. So it affects revenue, it affects public perception of onshore wind, it affects the supply chain at the moment. A really hot topic is the tightness of the supply chain and how busy their order books are in terms of turbines and various other things. So I think it's sort of looking to where you want to get to. What is it that you want to achieve? What is it that you want to do from a revenue perspective, from a co-location perspective? And then working back from that point, having those conversations in the supply chain, having those conversations with your landowner, for instance, and being realistic around different people's demands. Because an example might be with the landowner wanting a different rental arrangement or various other things, but having to realise...
Or they may be expecting... conversely, they might be expecting the same revenues that they may have got from the historic project. Exactly. And the world has moved on.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And the only way you can have those conversations is growing roughly what you're trying to achieve. So then it's working back from that and having those conversations early, thinking about it now. And the same for sort of grid, going in and having that conversation. And I think those that have prepared the most and have fought through these will be in the best position to repower and to bring these projects forward. And I think the wider story is it's a really positive story for repowering. It's so clear that we need these technologies and we need them quite soon. Absolutely. So there is a huge opportunity here.
Great. Well, lovely to end on a high. Thank you, Alec. That's much appreciated. If you'd like to find out more about this talk, about the expertise that we've got in this particular area, then get in contact with either of us via our website. These talks in their completeness will all be on the website and also on our YouTube channel as well. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Ross.